Yeah, so the first one is what you think it is, and the second one is what you believe it should be. All right, thank you for the perseverance. Okay, pretty good. This is working okay, right? Okay, good. Okay. Actually, I was just going to start off with a quick picture of this thing, the hedonometer, right? So it's really been crazy in the last few weeks because things have been crazy. It is a coarse measure, right? So it's all of Twitter. It includes the bots. It includes, plants that tweet. But it was going along somewhat stably for a while. But then, Charlottesville really pushed things down. It is the voice of Twitter, which is a collective piece. It will have more of a left-wing kind of bias, perhaps.
Does this always have a ignore, allow icon box on it?
Maybe not. I can't read. Oh, I know what that is. Ignore. Okay. It just needs to calm down. I don't know what to do with those things. Okay. Fine. Thank you. Silliness. Okay. All right, so we're trying to talk about this thing. Right, so then you have, maybe I showed you this the other day, but we'll just get to this, I suppose. This is where things were kind of recovering in terms of the, what's coming out of Twitter. Obviously, it's a very complex situation, and the discussion online, you would still see a lot of discussion of this, of course, but that's Saturday, Sunday, Monday. This is when Trump sort of goes back on what he said the day before, so it kind of goes backwards. Then we have a terrorist attack in Barcelona. There's a slow recovery. So we've never seen anything like this, right? It's always this sort of one day where bad things happen, and then one day later, it's like, oh, we're back to talking about sandwiches and Justin Bieber. There'll still be it's just that the news of so much news washes over the top of what's happened. And then this is the first time we've had, this goes back to 2008, it's the first time we've had to annotate hurricanes, right? Sandy was a tropical storm. It wasn't really a hurricane by that point. But it's been a long time since there's been landfall for a hurricane in the US. So, and then Irma is here, and that's a mixture because it has the repeal of the Dreamers Act as well. So really, it's just one measure of things. We're trying to gauge in this coarse way, and it's sort of a demonstration, but I just want to say it's unparalleled in what have we done this for? 9 years of recording things from Twitter and analyzing the overall sentiment. Okay. All right. So I'm going to finish off this bit about that we had here about scaling, and then we'll talk about power law size distributions. Yes. All right, so very famous one here. So we talked about language last. This is moving now into technology. A very famous one is Moore's law, and he wrote the paper in '65. Actually, he said, "Oh, look, things are going along, and there's some data back here, and it looks like this might keep going." He had to adjust it a little bit. It was about how many transistors would fit onto a chip of a certain area. That was the way it was framed to start with. But actually, another way to look at it is cost, right? So that so this is count here, but you can also have cost. So that the cost of transistors is going down as well. So that's another variation of it. This is a linear scale, right? Time here. This is linear. This is, we okay? Does it make sense? Yeah. This is a log scale. So this is growing. What is this then? Right? It's just linear. And this is a log scale, so you see that. It's a nice straight line. It's an exponential, right? Good. So it's an explosion. Of course, this has been a weird thing because it's meant that engineers and scientists have believed in this, right? And they've said, well, we must. When they sort of run out of what one technology can do, they sort of just believe there's going to be another thing we can, get to, another materials and so on, and that's happened. There is a limit eventually, and I guess we're trying to get to quantum computing now, which will allow all sorts of strange things. Okay. So I'm going to connect that with a couple of other laws for technology, and this is a learning curve kind of thing. So this is from a paper. It's 1936. So this becomes known as Wright's law, and it's about. So this is I mean, these graphs are amazing. Labor production costs, right? So this is for number of machines that are being produced, and so these are planes, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. The cost goes down, right? So you get better at making them, and you figure out how to solve problems. There are lots of people involved in this, so it's a complex, creative kind of enterprise. But you see this over and over again, and it's associated with learning curve kind of ideas as well. So this is published in 36, and it's written in that sort of very, the passive tense and so on, but passive voice, I should say. And this is sort of 14 years of watching people build airplanes, but was able to produce these nice curves. Okay, so there's a paper, so this is very recent, 2013, that ties these things together. And you think Moore's law is just Moore's law. There's one piece, but actually Moore's law and so on apply to many different technologies, quite different things. All right, so is this working? Let's see if that works. Yeah, good. So Wright's law can be framed in this way, right? So the cost of making a thing at time t decreases as a function of how much has been made, and it can be expressed in a power law way, right? So you get this nice decrease. And again, this is associated with things like organizational learning of all kinds, including terrorist acts, right? So this is very general. Moore's law can be written in this way, so sort of moving away from the number of transistors, it's about the cost of something, right? So the cost is decreasing in time. So this is, both of these things sort of, different ways to look at it, right? So if you're producing something regularly, okay, fair enough, you're getting better and better, but this is more straight up about how much of the stuff you've made, which makes sense as well. And then there's an observation by Sahel that we could put these things together so that the amount of stuff produced actually grows exponentially as well if you put these pieces together, right? So you can obviously just connect here and here, right? So the amount of stuff to the power of minus omega has this exponential seeming decrease, but then we'll take out that minus omega. So here it is, m over g. W is m over g, then we have the right connection. Very good. Okay, fine. So then go and look for this, and and with these slides, I'm just trying to point you to things in the world. So this is magnesium, PVC, memory, DRAM, right? So this is how much stuff is being made over time. So linear here, so it's growing exponentially. And these are very tiny little plots, but they've got them on. I guess they need to get them on scale. And this is the price decreasing exponentially. So we see those two things matching up quite well. These are extremely different things, right? And I think in this paper they maybe have 60 or 70 different kinds of fields showing that this is a very, let's plug in the power. Very widespread phenomenon. And it's just people figuring things out. So this is, again, so we've got stuff in the chemical, hardware, energy, other places. They're falling in the right way because you can measure these parameters and then compare them. So they have this kind of right form. Okay, that's good. Okay, one last bit for scaling. It's a paper from 2002, but it got kind of a little spike again in 2012 being talked about. I think this could be done better, but it's an interesting approach to it. I mean, just the the graphs and those sorts of things could be done better, but the basic idea is all there. So this is the number of Lego pieces here in a set, right? So you have a set, you have the total number of pieces, and then these are the number of distinct ones. So you could think about like words in a book, for example, and then the number of distinct books, right? This would be the lexicon here, and this would be the actual, the zoo of words. So that has a, this is slower than, this is a bit of a funny thing. It's log here. It's not beautifully done. It's not log 10. It is base 10. Okay, good. But this should be 10. Anyway, it's growing sublinearly. And this is just to put it on another scale. It's the same idea. So that's for Legos, but then they looked at a whole bunch of other things. And let's see, it's on this piece. So let's put it together. So the idea is you have network differentiation, which is the number of node types, and then the total number of nodes, right? So this is the number of words in your dictionary, and this is the number of the words in the book, for example, total. So many these would be the number of species in a forest, and then these are the actual count of all of the animals present. And then the idea is that this scales, right? So the number of, that's one way to put it. So you've got the sheer number of items, and then this is the number of distinct ones that's growing with, and they framed in this way with this 1 over d. And the idea is, right, so if they're all completely distinct, this would be, d would be 1, and the number of distinct things would be growing as the number of objects. Now we don't do that, right? We don't do it with language, we don't do it with Legos, we don't do it with all sorts of mechanical things, just very naturally, right? So we reproduce stuff over and over again. It gives us stable kinds of building blocks. You see it in software, for example, modules that are used over and over again, and then rarely used ones. So we can think about what will happen if it's a low D, right? Then it's strongly specialized, and high D, strongly combinatorial, meaning that in this case, there aren't many individual pieces or distinct pieces, and here there are many distinct pieces. Okay, and they have this sort of broad claim. It's an interesting one. The evolution produces systems that have only a few parts relatively, and when we build them, we tend to produce these ones that have lots of very distinct pieces in them. Okay, and even Legos, which seems like a funny little example, but over time actually Legos have sort of moved from this category to this category, which is weird. They've become much more specialized. So this is a bit of a big blob to show you, but this is really their combinatorial degree thing. So they have, for example, ant colonies here, right? There are only a few kinds of ants relatively. This is an organism thing for cells. So these are the natural selection or evolution pieces. Brain is here. Whereas we have things like, this is business. So this is the number of different kinds of employees, right? Similar for faculty here. So these are much lower numbers. And Legos are here as well. All right, and then electronic circuits actually, which is a bit weird. Electronic circuits, well, funny things. Okay. All right, so that's sort of a broad story about how many different types of elements there are within bigger systems. And much more could be done about that. Okay, so I want to get to the end of this so we can talk about the next piece. So scaling is this fundamental aspect of systems of all kinds, right? I mean, we've looked at language, we've looked at money to some extent, all sorts of biological systems, physical systems, happens over and over again. There are lots of different stories, of course, as to why it's there. Isometric and allometric, so they're two important terms to understand. I imagine you've heard of isometric before, but allometric is the piece to add here. It's generally accepted as a way to talk about it. Dimensional analysis allows us to get very far, right? So we know the surface area of spheres grows as the volume to the 2/3, for example. I mean, that's the Buckingham pi story. Physicists will do this all the time. They'll say it's just dimensional analysis, and I've done it on the back of an envelope. It's very, very good of them. They're very rude people. But there are unusual scalings that have taken us a lot longer to figure out, and there are some that we certainly are still debating about, and measurement is a big issue, and so on. All right, so that is a good thing to know about. As always, just to say this again, the references are hopefully all there, and you can dig into these things as you might wish. All right, good. Okay, so we are surviving. Okay. So how'd we go with that form? Did you get it done? Yeah? Moving through it? Okay, all right. I'm having a bad day, so make sure you give it back to me. Okay. All right, so what we're going to talk about here, so-called power law. So Pratchett's doing well. Okay. I'm going to define power law size distributions, or this basic idea, and then talk about how this compares to something like Gaussian distributions. And we're going to come back to Gaussians because there's a beautiful story there, a very important kind of one. That'll be in the next section, because we're going to talk about these things and then talk about mechanisms, like how do we get to these structures. This is complementary cumulative distribution functions. So cumulative distribution functions, very standard thing in probability. The complementary one will turn out to be very important for these power law size distributions. Zipf's law, extremely famous description of the distribution of sizes for lots of real things. So it's kind of this story over here. That comes from the late 40s, probably being observed in the 30s as well, but this, of course, prehistory. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and I'll show you how we connect these things properly. Okay. Okay, so the first thing is to talk about how terrible we are with probability and estimating certain kinds of things. I mean, we have some, we have some abilities here, but we're a bit odd. So Monty Hall problem. Do people know about this one? It's very famous, right? So this is yeah. So I'll just say what it is, but it's well, it was a game show, right? Actually, yeah. But it's, you can get tricked on a street actually if someone's got some coconuts. So imagine you've got your so three coconut halves, and there's a pebble on, there's a whatever. I guess let's say the Monty Hall one. So the Monty Hall one was there's a car behind one door, and then there were goats behind the others. We'll use that, right? And so someone, who's the contestant guesses one of the doors. And I know this is sort of funny. They did this all the time. So someone guesses the door, and then the person running the show says, "Well, I'm going to reveal one of the other doors." Right? Opens it up, and there's a goat behind it. So shows you one of the others you've chosen has a goat. So let's do that. So you choose number 2, and then he says, "Oh, okay, here's a goat, right? So there's a goat in here. That's not a good goat, but anyway, there's a goat. Do you want to change?" And there's no like betting or adding to anything. It's just, do you want to change from now? So if you haven't heard of this, just think what you would do, right? I know many of you probably have, but you've guessed here, and then you just opens another one and says, "Oh, there's a goat here. Do you want to change?" Right? What does it feel like you should do? What does it feel like should be true? There's just that what?
50-50 is debate.
The what's that?
The debate is 50-50.
Right, okay, it's 50-50. It shouldn't matter, right? That's the feeling, right? It's just like, how can information have been transferred to you? So this is very famous. So Marianne Savant, who would write a puzzle piece for the USA Today and sort of famously had the highest IQ ever measured, maybe, whatever, maybe. It's a funny sort of thing, but would had this puzzle section. I'm not sure if she still does it. Is it Marianne von Savant? Is that what it is? Is that right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
They sent her all sorts of horrible.
Right. So I think it's a name she chose for herself. Is that right? Or is it just an accident of? Because it's pretty great. She grew into that one. Yeah. Savant has this beautiful. It's a perfect meaning. I mean, it would have been more on the nose if it was Karen Genius, right? But it's kind of like that. So she gets all of this mail saying because she says, in fact, you should shift 2/3 of the chance that it's in this one is now 2/3, and now it's 1/3. And she got all this hate mail saying, "You are a complete idiot. You should not do this. This is a disaster," from professors and all sorts of other characters and professors of statistics. It's really pretty great, which they published, I think, as well. Like Professor such and such of whatever. And they were wrong, right? They were wrong. She was totally right. They were absolutely wrong. And people's your intuition for this fails you. Like your kind of gut response to this. I mean, I guess we can throw like 1,000,000 matchsticks on the ground and someone can say there's 1,000,003. But this we don't have the right response, right? And what it is the way to. And this became. I have a friend who was asked this for a job interview, like many years ago, and spent 45 minutes, because it was for an investment banking job, sort of having his brain contorted everywhere because he'd never heard of it. It is painful to think about. But the idea is, there are three worlds, and there's goat. One way to think about this is goat, car, goat, right? These are all equally probable worlds as far as you're concerned. So these are a third of a chance that all these things have happened, and you've just guessed. You don't have any goat. Tell me when I get something wrong. So these are all possible, and you've chosen. You could be in any of these worlds, right? So what happens is, if you're in this world, then they have two choices, right? They could open this one or this one. But if you're in this world or this world, and you've chosen, this is the one you've chosen, right? So let me say this. You've chosen here. This is your first choice. Then in each of these, they have to reveal this one and this one. So the car is definitely in the other one. So you are definitely living in either of these these three worlds with a third of a chance. But if you're living in these worlds, they've actually been forced. So the Monty has been forced to reveal where the car is. So you should shift, right? So you should shift here, you should shift here, and you'll lose here. And but that's sort of a little hard to sort of maybe come up with on the fly. I mean, it is a difficult, unsettling problem. So, has anyone heard of this one? Girl born on Tuesday? All right, so you know this one. So no one else has heard this? Okay, so not bad. This is a recent one, actually. It's freaky. Okay, good. This is a recent one. I think some conference where someone stands up the front and says, "I have a little puzzle for you guys," and they're like, "Oh yeah, we know everything." Right? So you have a parent who has two children. We're going to say they're not twins, and that there's some birth order, and that it's a 50-50 chance of having a boy or girl. We're just going to say, right, this is the world, and you are asked. So we can do this in a sequence of things, and I think I have it on the next set of slides. We'll come to that. I also want to point out what we're going to be talking about is logarithmic scales, and we've already done that with scaling, but that's going to come back with this power law size distribution stuff. This is an unsettling thing, right? Like, what is $1 trillion versus $100 million? Like, it's. But many things are just naturally logarithmic. Sound works like that, right? And we talk about it in the right way. If you're playing a piano or any musical thing, octaves work in that way, right? It's built into us there. This story here, which is a short one from Radiolab, the story here is that apparently tests on infants, or sort of moving into toddlers, I guess infants. There's a distinction between, say, 1 and 10 and 100. It's kind of there somewhat. You can do a better job like that. And for various peoples that do not have counting in their language, right, where anthropologists have gone to talk to them, apparently that happens too, that there's a sense of growing in number in that way, right? So 3 is equally distant between 1 and 10, or say, right? And 10 is between 1 and 100. And that's, if you think logarithmically, that's halfway between. Right. Bamford's law we'll get to later on, but that's how you should not cheat at taxes and other things. Okay. All right. Now that we're slamming humans, I want to talk about, I'll just mention the Dunning-Kruger thing as well, which if you haven't looked up or know about, you should investigate that. It's very amusing. Okay, sorry. It's this kind of, I guess in some ways an old notion, but it was done by a Cornell professor and his student. It was a test. It's somewhat debated as well now, which is a problem, but it was a test showed that people who are incompetent at doing something are also incompetent at assessing they're not good at it, right? So, and it was about a writing thing that they did and so on. It's not true for everything that people do, of course, but it explains something like American Idol or something, where people get up at the start of that and say how they thought they were the greatest singer ever, and it's kind of obvious that they aren't. But so there's some debate about it, I suppose, which is very unsettling. But this thing, you think, yes, humans are very silly and don't know, and then you have a horrible moment of realization that you're a part of that, and then you go back to doing something else. So anyway, okay. So here's the Tuesday problem. So a parent has 2 children. So what's a probability that both children are girls? And again, it's this. They're not twins. 50-50 chance. So think in your heads what that is. Anyone wants to make a claim? They can. Boldly. 1/4, right. So we can draw this sort of thing here too. Let's get rid of these goats. So you could have, and we'll put order like this, right? So it could be girl, girl, and then girl, boy, or boy, girl, and boy, boy, right? So these are all clearly 1/4 of a chance of happening if we've set out these rules in this simple way. So this is first and second. Okay, that's good. We don't mind it. And we're not saying, yeah, okay, good. Okay, all right, so the next thing, you have a parent who has 2 children, we know one of them is a girl, right? So what's the chance that both of them are girls? So we've conditioned it, which we didn't understand with it. I mean, we didn't have the intuition to understand that the Monty whole thing conditioned it as well. So this one is gone, right? So we can't have this world when we know we're not in that world. So now we're in this world. Well, there's a third of chance again like this, right? So for this world to have happened, there's a 1 in 3 chance. So this becomes, so it goes from 1/4 to 1/3. Fair enough. And we've added a pretty strong condition. We don't know if the girl comes first or second, right? So that's not said in this thing. So this is possible, this is possible. So that's a 4th, this is a 3rd. And then we add this, so same game again, but we know one of them is a girl born on a Tuesday. What's the probability both of them are girls? So it was exactly what we had before, but we've just added some more information. Slightly more specific. And then, you can do other things. Like one of them is a girl born on December 31st. What's the probability that both of them are girls? What is it? So what's really weird is it's 13/27. So that's not something that just pops out of your head, right? So you have to figure out, so this is a bit of a challenge. I'm just going to leave this here. To figure that out and also to figure out a nice way of explaining it, right? How do you get to a point of being able to tell a story that, that sort of, so you can get the intuition for it? So it's unnerving because right, born on a Tuesday, you sort of think, well, that can't, like, why, what does that matter? But what it does is it starts to separate these two. So for instance here, now you kind of have 3 groupings. You have a girl just born on any day, and then girl born on Tuesday, and then a boy. And so these are 3 pieces now. So that's sort of the thing to think about. It's a bit odd. All right. Okay, that's good. So this is just to show you, I mean, I feel this is like we are not very good with probability. So I'm going to just accept that. And we have this piece that we just did. So we'll see how we've done. I mean, I guess we're more into the age of, there are certain framings. 1%er is kind of a framing now, but that's an interesting one, right? 1% have what? Right? It doesn't really talk about what that, so there's some distribution of wealth. And just to sort of talk about the 1%er, right? So there's 100% of all people here, I suppose you could do it like that. Then, Scandinavia has a 1%. They have 1%ers as well. What I mean is that little thing by itself doesn't quite tell you if there's wealth imbalance. All right. And we talked about the other day how we have this notion of 500-year floods and 1,000-year floods and so on. Thank you very much. All right, I'll put those together. Okay, so we've just done these things, and I gave you the extremes, so thank you for doing all that. So let's see so there was a study done by a couple of, so Mike Norton, who's at the Harvard Business School, done lots of interesting things. He works on happiness actually a bit too. Actually, just had a paper that said the best thing you do is buy time, which, sure. Anyway, and Dan Ariely, so he wrote Rationally Irrational, I think. So he's had a number of popular books like this on economics. So he's an economist. He comes from a psychology background. All right, so let's see what people did. So this is the actual thing at the top. This is, of course, this is from a few years ago. This is 2011, so this would have been people in 2010 thinking about 2010. So here's the actual percentiles at the top, right? So the top, and the way this is drawn perhaps a bit differently what I should, but this is how much of the total amount of wealth that the top 20% has. So it's close to 85%. Yeah? And then the next 20% has about 10%, then the next 20% has about 5%, and the bottom 40% have essentially 0, right? So it's extreme, it's extreme. And this is what people estimated. So they understood it was going to be biased. They gave the bottom, on average, the bottom 20% would have something here, and the bottom 40% would have about 10, so definitely uneven. But this is really to 0, and this collapses to here, and this collapses to here, and this expands. And then these are the ideals, right? So this is not even Scandinavia. This is sort of insanely equal, right? This is pretty hard to achieve. So really pushed a long way back. So then there were a couple of extra details about that. So the top 20% would just have a little more than, say, 30% here.
Is the green box bigger than the brown box?
I'm sorry if this is hard for people to see. Sorry if this. Which one?
It looks like the green box is bigger than the brown.
It's pretty equal. It shouldn't be bigger. Oof, that would be bad. I can measure with a spoon. I think it's a little bit small, yeah. Spoon, according to spoon. Okay. I usually have a soup ladle, but we had to use it for soup. Okay. All right, so then, and even more, they did this very nice thing where they looked at some of the demographics of these people, right? So there's the top one, the actual, at the top is the actual spread of the quintiles. And then this is for people who earn less than 50K. So this is an income thing. These are people who voted for Bush and Kerry, men and women. There are some minor differences, but they're really similar. So this is an odd thing where you frame a question in a certain way that people don't lock in the political beliefs or whatever, and they come out being on sort of the same team, right? So very interesting. And then the ideals, again, not super varied, right? It makes sense, right? So people who were wealthier tended to kind of skew it more, right? And Bush voters tended to skew, Republican voters tended to skew it a little more this way. Men tended to skew a little more this way. But, these are not dramatically different. So again, lots of very strong similarity there and strong similarity there. So that's interesting in and of itself. But the big story is really this incredible difference between these three things, right? So reality, estimate of reality, and estimate of the ideal reality. Okay. All right. So what's behind these sorts of things? I mean, I'm going to talk about power law size distributions, but I want to say in general these are highly skewed distributions or distributions with heavy tails. You'll hear that kind of verbiage. Fat tails is another thing people will say. You will see this actually in the literature. But heavy tail distribution is probably the main one. So they're very odd, surprising things. So this is the basic thing we're going to look at, right? So we've looked at these scaling laws. So it's going to be x to the minus gamma. And we're going to have gamma greater than 1. That's just a little question I have for you in an assignment. So it's going to decay as a power law. There's going to be some, and this is sort of just an example mathematical one, right? So there's going to be some typical, there's going to be a minimum size of x and some maximum size, right? There's some, and this doesn't have to be, this could be infinity, right? It could go all the way up. But there's going to be some, right? Because when this is 0, this will explode. So there has to be something that happens to this distribution. Either there is a cutoff, we call these things the cutoffs, lower cutoffs, sorry, I got it the wrong way. The lower cutoff and upper cutoff, again, just what we words that people use. It could be fuzzy, a little bit messy, or the distribution could change, right? It could just roll over in some way. But this is the basic idea. And again, just as we did for the scaling laws, we can take the log of both sides. And we're talking about probabilities now. This is a probability distribution, right? So the integral over this thing has to be 1, basic things. Take the log 10 again. So log 10 of the c pops out by itself. We have log 10 of x to the minus gamma. So that will be here. And then the minus gamma can come down here. So this is, if we're looking to fit curves, then this is a straight line in double logarithmic space, right? So that's and we use log 10 because we're good people. Maybe it's this thing. So something I found out recently, we have a car that doesn't, you can't use the key very well, right? You have to like do this and all this stuff. But if you put it next to your head, have you heard of this? Yeah? You put it next to your head or maybe in your mouth, it works because your skull acts as sort of a projector thing, so maybe I need to do that with this. It's a good tip. Okay. Yeah? Okay. It's very funny. We use log 10 because we're good people, all right? So we do that. All right. So we're going to, so it's usually it's a tail. And I was getting to that, I suppose. Usually it's just the tail that obeys this. There's some structure at the start that has some other form. As I said, fat-tailed, heavy-tailed. And we'll, x large, right? This is, this is loose at the moment, but, be like x much greater than some characteristic x, for example, would be a way of putting this. As I said, we're going to talk about parallel size distributions a lot, but there are other beasts that have these kinds of heavy tails, and they have different forms, and people argue about which one is which. And they argue about them usually in the right way eventually, which is, well, do you have a mechanism that produces this thing, or this thing, or this thing, right? And can we see that mechanism is at work? And we're going to see that that's been an argument for, there's been arguments about that for, 80 years now, something like that. Some amusing back and forth between some pretty famous characters, and we'll see where we are now. All right, so many systems, there are discrete sizes, and so that's good too, that's fine. So word frequency, right, we just count up how many words are in an article. Node degree in networks, right, so the number of friends or the number of links between, from a page to another page, say. Citations for articles. These things, something like friends, so this is the natural way to do it. You just look at a network and say, oh, this one has 3 friends. But of course, there are weights on those things. So you can start to make these more continuous in nature. But we get a long way with this kind of bare network story. All right, and we have the same idea here, right? There'll be a minimum k, maximum k. Again, these a k to the minus gamma thing, right? So, okay. And it's typically about the tail. So here's a little example, just to show you kind of what these distributions look like. This is a famous corpus of language from the UK. It's an inclusion of everything. So I think there's radio transcripts, newspaper articles. They just sort of dump a ton of stuff in. These corpuses are interesting for finding out things like spelling mistakes and all sorts of changes in words that are being used. But they fail in a very profound way. In Google, if you've looked at Google n-grams, someone ever played around with that? So this is an extra, and we have actually the books behind this now. It's like terabytes of data. Let me just talk about corpuses a little bit because. So has anyone seen this? Little, but not really? Yeah, okay. So Google did some bad things to lots of books and scanned them, right? That probably hurt their spines a little bit. So they scan all these books, and then there's optical character recognition, which is applied to it. So you get some trouble back here because a lot of S and Fs get confused. So there's some weird things that happen. If these have kind of gone out of style a little bit, but captures and recaptures, for your password, they would often have, so they would have a scrambled looking word that you could, you would say what it is. That was if there were two of them, one would be made by a computer, and the other would be from this project probably, right? So it's taken a little bit of text that couldn't be figured out easily, it wasn't sure about it statistically, and they're using us as little computers, right? It got a little, so that was good. I mean, this is for the good of the, sort of everyone, I suppose, getting everything quantified, but it then started to show house numbers. Has anyone seen those? That was creepy. That was just wrong. Okay. So it goes back in time, but 1800 is a fairly good starting point. The big problem with this is it doesn't have popularity, right? So every book is equally as important as every other book, right? So Harry Potter just gets the same number of votes as anything else. And this is a ridiculous one to look up, but Frodo, for example, it's kind of weird, right? So you would think it's actually become less popular. But it's only from, I mean, this is why I'm choosing that because it's one of the most popular books ever, I suppose. So that's a problem with these things. Anyway, so somehow they don't really have popularity in them. People use this to show, I don't know, say empathy, right? So they'll do bad things with this, empathy, right? So, oh, it's gone up. So they say empathy's gone up, right? But that's not good. That's not a good way to do this. Anyway, we have a paper from a few years ago to show that this is and in fact there are many languages and all sorts of things. The big problem with this, on top of the fact that each book gets one vote, is that it's actually full of science, right? So let's see. I know this is a little discussion, but experiment maybe. Yeah, see it really took off. This is a good one, fig. Yeah, I think they've been playing with this. But fig, for figure, is what's going on there, science. Come on. Yeah, see, that's just weird. And it's actually the rise of science. So anyway, that's good too. Let me get back to what I was trying to talk to you about. All right, so we have these guys. So the, of, and so the percentage, and this is actually 100%, yeah. So in this particular corpus, a lot of these, right, the is usually around 4%, but that's kind of remarkable. You're reading something and you just read the over and over again, but you're quite happy with it. Strange. And then there are rarely used words. Then these ones will be more meaningful. They'll be more surprising when you see them. So they, from an information point of view, they give you more information. About 20% of all words, roughly, will be in a text. Will be, say in English, will be these 6 words. That's a lot. Journalists get paid by the word, right? So my wife's a journalist. They get paid by the word. It's a weird thing to get paid for. It's in the past it used to be like $1 a word, but that meant that 20% of your income was from writing these words here. But it is the nature of language. So we have this odd thing in language where we have these pieces we use over and over again, and then there's sort of this hierarchy as we go down to rarer and rarer pieces. This is from Jonathan Harris, who partly grew up on Shelburne Farms, done many beautiful things, and you could go and look at his stuff online, but he's sort of a scientist. Yeah, let's get this one. Still works? It doesn't work. Oh, I have to use Flash. No, it's not happening. Sorry. We're not going to do that. We've got some visual pieces here anyway. So this is the start of it, right? And then he's got this thing, and you kind of just search around. People started to find all sorts of like pairs of words, like Bible code style, right, that meant something. They were sort of suspicious, wrote all sorts of things. And he did a sneaky thing where he looked at what people searched for, which of course turned out to be a lot of profanities and yeah. Okay. Humans, right? So yeah, so as you go across corpus, like New York Times doesn't have any profanities basically, right? Whereas Twitter is ridden with it, and they're pretty important words, right? So you have to, if you're going to evaluate Twitter with something that's based on the New York Times, it's not going to work. Also, ha ha ha, that's important. Really matters. And lol. So this is, so you probably know XKCD, but so this was an effort to play with this weirdness that we have with language, that we have these very common words and then increasingly less used words. It was from the top 1,000 words, and again he had to go to some corpus and say this is going to be my standard. So that's an upgo of 5, right? So everything's being explained with words that only appear in the first 1,000 of a particular corpus. So the is going to be in there, but it really, so both, there's no submarine, right? Submarine is not in the 1,000 most commonly used words, so, but he did pretty well. Obviously contorted a lot of things. Insanity, right? Total insanity. So that's a whole book, which is Thing Explainer, yeah. And I guess he was able to get complicated stuff in simple words. He was able to, complicated I guess is common enough. Surely that's not outside of it. That's very enjoyable. Nice big coffee table book. Okay, so we'll come back to the Gaussian, but let's look at the Gaussian. So, okay, classic, very famous, beautiful thing, has this form, which is remarkable, and we'll derive it actually. But here's an example of one, right? So a mean of 10, and then sort of characteristic width here. This is putting it on a log-log scale, which is a little weird, but you see it sort of skews it in this funny way. But you can see it here, right? This is clearly a normal distribution. We wouldn't worry about this. Okay, so here's a quick thing to do. See if you can just do a graph, right? We're going to old school kind of parabola, whatever, straight line. Make this graph, right? So probability of x is going to decay as x to the minus 1. You can just say it's, so basically plot 1 over x from 1 to 10 to the 7. There you go. Do some axes, right? So you've got 1, 10 to the 7, x, p of x. And then just scribble it down in front of you. See what you think. Wow. Again, this is just, you doing what you can. So let's look at what it looks like. This is what you should have drawn. So this does not look like much happens for this distribution, right? There's the here actually, right? That's the, and that'll be of, and I guess it was and so those guys seem like they're going to happen, right? If we randomly sample from this big box of words, which about, whatever, 6 and some % of them will be these. So we're going to pull out, imagine we've got a huge bin of balls, right? That actually is a classic model we'll get to later on, urn models, which is a very old kind of word. But you've got this urn or a container, and it's full of little ping pong balls, and you pull them out, right? Like the lottery. And they have words on them. You would think you're never going to get these words out here, right? Because this is just 0, and you're going to 6% of the time you will get these. It's true. But this is the same sort of thing we see for earthquake distributions, for weird things like the diameters of moon craters. There are all sorts of weird things that follow this, and things that matter that follow this kind of shape. If we now plot it on a log-log plot, this is where you start to see that this has a heavy tail, right? So linear plots will never show you anything here, and they'll make you feel like, it's okay. But you have to do logs, not just this example, but for any kind of distribution, and you feel like it's decaying away, you need to put in some logs just to see if there's some shape in there. And in fact, it does, right? This example does obey this kind of thing, and it's a all right, let me say what this is. So this is a frequency distribution, right? So the number of words that appear, this many times. Oh, I know what I've misled you in the way I've talked about this. I have. Sorry. Okay. This is the frequency of occurrence. Right. Sorry. This is the size of the thing. This is the size of the thing. So please, I said the wrong thing about where the is. The is here. This is confusing. The is here, of is here, and so on, so on, so on, right? So that's going to be the, of, and, right? So the number of words that appear 6.8% of the time, there's only one of them. And then we get back down to here, we start to see words. There are 2 words that have that frequency of occurrence. And then these are 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. And then there are, way back here, there are words that appear once. So this will be 1 out of the total population. There are many of those. Excuse me. Yes, the words are actually here, and I could have read them. So it is a bit confusing, because we're going to flip it around in another way, which will add to the confusion because of what I've done with my words. Okay, so, but this is the way it's structured, right? So this is the size of the thing out here. So the big things are, they're rare in the sense that there's only one that appears, that has that frequency of usage. But there are many that appear once. So if you look at it in this way, what we're doing is we're saying all the rare things, right? We'll combine all of the rare things. So collectively, they're a big team, right? So the ones that appear once, all these different words, they make for a big category. The ones that appear many, many times, well, after some point, there's only one of those, right? Okay. Did that help, or did I just make it completely confusing? This is just the raw counts, right? Raw counts. Yeah, it's just a histogram. Yep, exactly. So these words have a special name for them, words that appear once in a text, a hapax legomena. And there's a weird thing, we'll get to it later, that in a text, so you've got your text, you read Moby Dick, and then over here you have your lexicon for Moby Dick, right? So these are all the words that are in Moby Dick. You've got the, of, so you just have this list. You make it a dictionary. Half of the words in your dictionary will appear only once, which is strange, right? Half of them appear once. Very strange. So that's generally true of a sufficiently large text. Half of the, if you make the dictionary for your text, right, find out all the unique words, half of them will appear once. So they seem, well, they're important, right, because they are very special. They're rare. And then there'll be ones that appear twice and 3 times. About a sixth of them will appear twice. And then you'll have some that appear an enormous number of times, and it gets up to be 4 or 5% for the. Okay. Okay, so this is a little messy looking, right? And we want to measure a straight line, do linear regression. It's a bit of a worry because we've got these things out here. So what people have been doing now for quite a long time is measuring the exceedance probability, or looking at that. So I'm going to use this notation. So this is n greater than q. So these are the number of words that appear at least with this probability, or this with this percentage of the time, q. So when we go back, there were 2,000 words in this list. All of them appear at least, according to the minimum. So that's going to be 2,000, then it drops away. And what we see again is the log version of this is much, much better, right? So you see this kind of bends out a little bit, but the log version is good. And you also now see it's cleaned, right? So what we'll see, this is an integration. Integration smooths things. So we can do regression on this, and that's a much cleaner estimate of the exponent, right? Okay, so we'll do that. So when we get out to here, how many words appear at least as many times as the? There's only the, right? And so there's 1 here, this is 2, 3, 4. So we simply count, right? This is 1, this is on a log scale. This would be, if you come over to this axis, this is really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Simply doing that. How many words appear at least as often as this particular Q? And because there are breaks in Q out here, you see these jumps. It's quite smooth here. Okay. You can, so this is a bit of a funny thing. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of words. I mean, they get more and more exotic. But how do you test your vocabulary, right? You're not going to do that easily. We're not going to do this collectively. You can, actually. This is sort of a fun test. And I ran it by Jacques Bailey. Does anyone know who Jacques Bailey is? He's a classics professor here at UVM, and he is the spelling bee guy. So he won it in 81 or 82 with elucubrate, which means to study deep into the night with midnight oil, is the origin of that word. But he's the guy who asks the questions of the spelling bee contestants. And so he's always on ESPN, and now he's in ads on ESPN, which is quite funny. He lives around the corner from us. Anyway, but he got 40,000 or something on this. So if you get over 40,000, something like that. So you could test yourself. Yeah.
Did he come to Amy's thesis?
Yes, he's been on some of the committees for our students. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. So he teaches Latin and Greek and all those things. And if you can give him a word he can't spell, you get an A. Wow. Within some reasonable parameters. Yeah. So now we're going to look at some other examples of these things, and we'll come back to these CCDF pieces in a bit, but I just want to give you some more things. So this is earthquakes, right? So we've gotten to this cumulative, this complementary cumulative distribution idea. So this is the number of earthquakes with magnitude greater than m. So it's smooth. You always expect these things to be smooth, and you're going to get down to some, right? This is the largest one ever measured, at least in this data set. So we'll get down to whatever, this is normalized. We'll get down to 1, and that'll be it. So yeah, slope of about -1, which is a dangerous slope. We can talk about that a little more later on. This is weird, actually. This is just a weird thing. So there's this paper, Unified Scaling for Earthquakes. They managed to publish it in 2 different places. They got into trouble for that. Pretty high-profile places. This is a problem, because a great problem with natural disasters is that we get bigger and bigger things over thousands of years, 10,000s of years, and of course it's hard to remember, right? It's hard for us to do a good job of remembering how big things were. I mean, I'm sure we're doing a better job now, but let's think back in time. And so this is from an article. This is Kenneth Chang. He's done a lot of great stuff in the New York Times. This is about the tsunami off of Japan from the quake there that affected the nuclear reactors. Terrible, terrible thing. So there'd been nothing like that in the last 300 years, and so that's many generations of people. So it's not being complacent or anything. It's just it just sort of passes out of the culture a little bit. As much as people would say, this could happen. Da, da, da. So the fact that nothing had happened, they're not being primed by it. And in fact, I don't think that's quite what I want to say. There's a piece in there, right? So people didn't think this could happen, right? So, and the Indian Ocean was a terrible disaster, of course. People really didn't think tsunamis could happen there like that. But there were stones put into the ground that said, "Do not build past here," right? And they were put in, I think, 1300s or something like that. And of course, eventually over time, people did, right? So these stones became these barriers that were, had been built past, Houston, right? I mean, people knew this was not a good plan, right? To get rid of marshlands and keep building, but so it's hard, very hard thing to stop people from doing these things. These events, they can be just absolutely enormous, and it's very hard to predict them. So a bunch of Italian, I don't know if they ended up in jail exactly, but I think they were thrown in jail initially. Italian scientists were rounded up for saying that these aftershocks at least wouldn't be as bad as people, they sort of put a limit on them, and they were worse, and so it's very, very difficult business predicting these things. So that's a serious one. There are other places where we have these parallel size distributions. This is for cuisines, right? So this is the number of ingredients that appear in at least K recipes, right? So actually, Bagro is on another paper that's similar to this, which looks at the network of recipes, or the network of foods based on the tastes and so on inside them. And it's an interesting complex network story. Okay, so we're going to get to these later on. This is a big one we're going to look at. Herbert Simon, incredibly famous. Polymath, was at CMU actually for most of his career, did all sorts of things. But this is this class of skew distribution functions, right? So he's talking about these power law size distributions, and he was thinking about them as appearing in language, as appearing in the number of species per genus, right? So very different thing. And a number of other examples. And why would you get these distributions? These things have nothing to do with each other. Mark Newman, who is incredibly productive genius character at Michigan, he this is a paper you could go through if you want. Lots of good examples. I'll pull some out and show you here. Aaron Clauset and Cosmo Shalesian Newman. This is a paper by them a few years later, talking about measuring power laws. This has become kind of the standard way that people do it, because it is tricky, it is messy. Actually, you'd think you're just doing a straight line, but you have to be careful. So these are some examples from Newman's paper, and maybe this is a good place to just get to. Right, just to sort of give you, we've looked at a few examples now, but earthquake magnitude is here. This is a number of books sold, for example, and the details are all here. Word frequency is the classic one we talk about, citations to papers, web hits, right? So this is links or hits to particular sites. This is the crater diameter, which is absurd, on the moon. There's a wealth one here. Name frequency, actually, right? So, I mean, this is a strange thing we do, right? I mean, people's names, right? We just use the same names again, right? And I'll have some of that for social contagion later on, where you can see names spreading around the states over many, many, many years, right? So at some point, it's all Jennifer, right? Every state in the US is just, the most common name is Jennifer. And that's actually the whole of the 70s. And the US has had a lot of, there's a huge Michael story, right? There are clubs of Michaels, basically. But names falling out of fashion and people emulate them. But that's another one of these power law size. It's a, what are we doing, right? And then you've got all sorts of odd ones. You have misspellings and things, sometimes purposeful. City populations, and that was another very famous one with the Zipf's law thing. So what they're trying to indicate here is that this is not good scaling, right? There's not clear scaling there, it's rolling over, and there's scaling here that might be okay. So all of those little pieces there, they have an algorithm which simply sort of tries to move around this minimum piece here and say, oh, this is no good, we're going to get the fit from here to here. This, I still feel, could be done much better, because there's some bad behavior potentially at each end, right? So there's the smallest things could be maybe not measured or just have a different kind of shape to the distribution, and the large ones can be not measured that much, and we'll get to that later on, right? So if you're sampling from one of these distributions, it takes a long time to get these things, right? The big earthquake or the whatever, and if you're just doing it on a computer, it takes a long time to get these events, right? So you have to just wait and wait and wait, and that's when you think again about the 10-year flood, the 100-year flood, 1,000-year flood. Eventually you'll get big spikes. What else was there? I think I had them all. Okay, so yeah, really odd things, and this is more of a list. So we talked about and I don't have plots for some of these, I just wanted to write them down. Number of war deaths. So this is Richardson, the one who has the number in fluid dynamics named after him and worked on the coastline and all that sorts of things. Was in the First World War and then came back and thought maybe he could think about these things mathematically. This is a terrible thing. Sizes of forest fires, somewhat debated, of course, but and it depends what we've done as humans. We'll come back to forest fires later on. If we put in fire breaks, different kinds of scalings are being there's different errors for these things. Some more examples. I've got these ones. Wealth, tree trunk diameters. That's pretty weird, actually, right? So you go out to a forest and there's a diameter at breast height is a standard thing. So there's a standard distance off the ground which you should measure diameters, right? Good thing for ecologists working on trees is the trees don't run away, so you can come back and see them. So that's an interesting piece of stuff. This is weird. If you go to a random point in the universe, this is the Holtzmark distribution. It decays as if the gravitational force you expect is going to decay, right? So we'll get to this framing. soon of wild versus mild, which means the idea will be the wild ones are you sample things, and most of your examples are small, right? You get a lot of small things, right? So if you randomly teleport around the universe, most of the time you're in space and nothing happens, right? But you could be very unlucky and end up very close to a star and things go. So, I mean, that's a ridiculous thing. But there are these, that's characters of this sort of, it will be about whether this exponent is greater or less than 2, actually, and greater or less than 3. That will be sort of the crucial transitions. There are super, super weird distributions, and one that we'll come back to, I'll just give you a little preview, right? So if we have a random walker, so here's the distance from home, and here's time, and they're randomly walking around. So one thing we might ask is, what's the first time they come back? And this could be used for, ruin and so on in a poker game or in a casino. What's the probability that they come back at time t? So it turns out that that decays as t to the minus 3/2. And what you'll eventually be able to sort of just see straight away, that minus 3/2, so it's between -1 and -2, you will see that this is a fine distribution, but it has not just an infinite variance, but an infinite mean, right? So the probability that this character comes back is 1, but the expected time is infinity. So it's very strange. Very, very strange. Okay, so let me just finish this last little set of things. I've talked about these. Religious adherence in cults, actually, right? So cult sizes have these distributions. Lots of little ones, and then some bigger ones, and bigger ones, and bigger ones, right? Sightings of birds per species, which is fun, right? And then species per genus, very famous one as well. So this is just a few things, very, very odd, peculiar set of beasts, and some of them will matter tremendously, like earthquakes and so on, in terms of damage and what can happen. All right, so this is statistics of surprise. So we're not here on Tuesday, right? Not here on Tuesday. I will produce something that will make up for that, and then we'll be back on Thursday. Okay, thank you.